On the morning of September 12th, at the end of the summer of 1965, the ceiling fan at Dufour Grocery pushed the hot air like a slow shovel, unhurried and merciless, spreading through the room the smell of coffee brewed too long, flour someone had spilled when opening a sack, and the salted shrimp that came from the ice boxes, because refrigeration there still depended on ice delivered and replaced. In Louisiana, humidity clung to the walls as if it had no intention of leaving. The spring-loaded door squeaked with every entry from St. Claude Avenue, and with it came the noise of the Claiborne Line buses, a slice of white sun striking the tile, and the reminder that the street, in some spots, was still uneven with debris and hurried repairs. That week, New Orleans spoke of Hurricane Betsy as if it were still outside, waiting to come back because the cyclone's passage on the night of September 9th to 10th had left a combination of wind, storm surge, and levee failures that flooded entire neighborhoods and knocked out power and telephone service in many stretches. Crooked poles, freshly nailed boards, and watermarks on houses in the lower Ninth Ward said, without needing explanation, that for a few days the water had ruled more than any man, and that the line of dried mud on planks and steps marked the height it had reached. On the counter, held down by a paperweight, there was a mimeograph sheet with new rules for food coupons and emergency aid, purple ink and letters that blurred where the paper was thin, and what was being decided there between a sack of beans and a jar of candy was simple to state and hard to sustain. In what language a family would be able to understand what it thought it could demand in order not to go hungry? And what would happen when that understanding met a tired service window or a patrol on the street at a moment when city and state offices were operating with reduced staff, soak files, and lines that started early? The grocery sat on the edge of Faubourg, Marigny, and Bywater, close enough to the river for a metallic taste to show up in the breeze, with truck traffic and the movement of docks and warehouses trying to regain their rhythm after the interruptions. It was a small place, tall shelves, a darkened wooden counter, a chalkboard behind the register where the owner wrote in chalk the price of sugar and oil, prices that swung with the temporary lack of deliveries and with the rush for basic items like powdered milk, canned goods, and kerosene. People who came and brought a mix of languages as old as the cobblestones of the French Quarter. Grandmother's French, school English, Spanish from work at the port, and underneath it a local way of joining everything in a single breath, in a neighborhood where the flow of people from the river, downtown, and residential areas made the language change from corner to corner. The bilingual clerk was named Lucía Boudreaux. She was 26, her hair pinned in a bun that never lasted the whole shift, and hands that constantly smelled of cheap soap, the common shelf soap used to scrub away salt and the day's grime. Her name tag, made from masking tape, said Lucía in crooked block letters, as if even her identification had to be improvised. Many people nearby did not read English with confidence, and some, out of pride or exhaustion, pretended they did, especially when the paper came with letterhead and seemed to demand obedience. They called Lucía to explain, but explaining was not the same as translating, and she knew that because every sentence came with a trap. Who had the right? Who could apply? Who had to prove within what deadline in a period when household documents have been lost to water, mud, and hurried evacuations? A verb, chosen one way or another, could change an entire week. That morning before noon, a mother with 2 children and a man in a soaked hat were already waiting, staring at the sheet as if it were a road map with a main stretch missing, because the administrative text, printed to circulate quickly, offered no examples and no counterside explanation. The owner, Mr. Dufour, stayed behind the register, pinching his mustache between his fingers, nervous about the line and the possibility of confusion. He did not like politics. He liked paid bills and full shelves, and he knew that after a storm credit and running tabs grew at the same time cash disappeared. But the grocery was an unmarked center. Messages were passed there. News was gathered. Small fights were settled before they became big ones. After Betsy, that intensified. The mail was delayed. Offices were piled with paper, and churches served soup, often in parish halls and improvised kitchens, with donations and big pots. And the rules, arriving on thin paper, decided who got what, amid assistance programs that demanded forms, proof, and screening, even when the emergency was obvious. Lucía had learned to translate at home, not in a classroom. Her mother, born near St. Bernard Parish, spoke an old French when she got tired, a French of household use and neighborhood life, more oral than written. Her father, who had come from Havana before the war and worked hauling sacks at the port, mixed Spanish with the English of orders in the street, the English of short instructions and shifts. Lucía had grown up hearing both, and the neighbors too, and had developed a quick ear for the meaning of a sentence even before understanding every word. But now it was not family talk, it was government text. And government text seemed made not to fit into any language, with standardized terms and formulas that protected the agency writing more than the person reading. The first to ask for help was Mrs. LeBlanc, who lived in a small wooden house near Poland Avenue, the roof patched with a tarp since the storm, the tarp held down with slats and nails, as could be seen on many houses still waiting for shingles and a carpenter. She held a cloth bag and a crumpled envelope. The children, a girl with braids and a boy in a shirt bigger than his body, looked at the jars of mint candy on the counter. The request came with a simple gesture, a finger pointing to a line in English where expressions like emergency food assistance and eligibility were piled together. Lucía pulled the sheet closer and read it silently first, as she did when she wanted to be sure she would not stumble. Eligibility requirements, household income, proof of residence. The tension did not come from the difficulty of the words. It came from the weight they carried, because each item implied a document that might have been lost in the flood or stained enough to be rejected. Lucía adjusted the explanation to the woman's ear in simple French, choosing words that would not humiliate. The central idea was that there was help because of the hurricane, but with requirements about address and income, and with the need to present something the window would accept as proof. Mrs. LeBlanc frowned and placed on the counter an old electric bill, stained, the kind of paper that survived in a high drawer when the water rose, with a stamp and an address still partly legible. Her question, in French mixed with English, came in the practical way of someone with no time for theory. How to prove residence when the house had taken water up to the window, and when what paper remained seemed to have been chosen by chance. Lucía looked again at the sheet and at the envelope. The official sentence suggested need, and the word need, said the wrong way, could sound like a door slamming. She chose a phrasing that showed what the office usually demanded without turning it into a sentence. The explanation came out as a concrete recommendation. Any letter, bill, or notice with an address would help avoid giving a reason for refusal, and when possible, something more recent, because windows tended to distrust old paper in times of displacement. Mrs. LeBlanc took that in as a task, not a promise, and the line behind her breathed a little, as if it were possible to divide the problem into steps, even knowing that each step meant time, transportation, and waiting. Behind her, a man named Tomás Rivera waited with hands full of calluses and the expression of someone who had already heard too many no's. He worked in a shop near the port, spoke Spanish and broken English, and understood little French. When his turn came, he pushed toward Lucía a notice about curfew and movement restrictions in damaged areas, with reference to the New Orleans Police Department and the National Guard, the kind of communique that circulated in copies and postings, with a language of order and threat. His worry sat in his body, raised shoulders, the way he held the paper, as if it were a ticket. Lucía read it. The curfew was real in some areas, especially where there was risk of looting, downed wires, and streets still without steady lighting, because the electrical grid and public lighting were coming back in stages, and not always evenly. The paper used shall not and subject to arrest. Lucía had already heard stories of people stopped on the corner just for being there with bags and taken to the truck, in encounters where the explanation came later, if it came. She did not inflate or soften the text. She tried to make the rule fit what he needed to do that night. Get home in one piece, bread in hand, without turning an ordinary route into a reason for detention. The translation she built in Spanish made the time clear, the focus on the marked streets, and the consequence stated on the paper. It also made clear that it was not the whole city, so as not to spread panic without need, because information without precision became rumor, and rumor became risk. Tomas reacted with the common question of someone who lives by the clock and an impatient boss. What about getting back from work? Lucía searched the sheet. There was no clear exception, only a vague line about authorized personnel. A word was missing that would offer protection. If she said there was no exception, he might not even try to go home. If she said there was, she could push him into trouble. She held to the text and added what the street taught. Carry some paper showing where he came from and where he was going, and try not to go past the hour, because arguing on the sidewalk rarely helped, especially when authority was backed by a printed notice. Mr. Dufour cleared his throat, impatient with the time being spent. Lucía nodded and continued. The line was a chain of needs: sugar, powdered milk, candles, kerosene, soap, items that gained importance when power failed and running water was irregular on some blocks. And over everything, paper with rules. With each explanation, she noticed something that bothered her more than the heat. People left with a different idea of what they thought they could demand, depending on how she chose the verbs. May became must. May apply became will receive. May be arrested became they will arrest. It was as if reality had shifting edges, and language was the hand pulling those edges. In a context where the difference between possibility and guarantee was the difference between a trip downtown and coming back with nothing. That same afternoon, Mrs. Nguyen appeared, coming from the Algiers side, with a baby in her arms and a cousin who spoke more English, crossing the city by routes that in that period could be slower because of blockages and repairs. She asked for rice and also asked Lucía to read a pamphlet about tetanus vaccination distributed after the floods, because cuts and punctures from debris and wetwood were common and the risk was treated as a public health issue. The paper mentioned free clinics at places like Charity Hospital and a temporary station at a school near St. Bernard Avenue. Lucía translated carefully and noticed how the word free could become too much trust when someone had already been charged for something they had promised would be simple, especially when there were fees, forms, or identification requirements. She fitted the information into practical gestures. Hours, locations, the recommendation to bring whatever documents existed, because the city at that moment was full of improvised stations and rules changing from table to table, with service depending on the day, the employee, and the vaccine supply. When the spring-loaded door swung shut for the last time that night, and Mr. Dufour closed the shutters, Lucía stood for a moment looking at the chalkboard with the prices. The chalk had been erased and rewritten so many times that the background always looked dirty, as if the surface kept the memory of every shortage and every restocking. She thought of her father, who said a word was a tool. There, a word was also a risk, because the risk was not only in the sound, but in what the sound made someone expect from the world, and what the world returned when that expectation met a counter with a stamp. On Thursday, September 16th, the grocery received a new packet of mimeograph sheets. This time it was not only about Betsy. There were changes in voter registration and references to literacy test requirements. Circulating through the city, like news no one wanted to hold for long, so as not to be implicated, because the subject still drew surveillance and retaliation in many places in the South. The Voting Rights Act had been signed on August 6th, and in New Orleans, many people commented that the rules were changing, but that customs took longer than ink, and that counterpractice did not always follow the law on paper. In a neighborhood, conversations mixed hope and distrust. There were people who had never tried to register because they knew what came. Impossible questions, humiliation, the polite shove to come back another day, and the feeling that the mistake was always on the side of the one asking. The pamphlet had official language and an address: Orleans Parish Registrar of Voters, in the courthouse building near Tulane Avenue. It spoke of federal oversight and the right to register without discrimination. It did not cite famous names. It cited procedures, hours, and documents, as if the neutrality of procedure were enough to erase the history of barriers. That paper had nothing to do with beans or flour, and even so, it arrived at the counter as if it were merchandise. The one who brought it was the reverend of a small church on Dauphine Street, a thin man known as Mr. Baptiste, who spoke English with a light French underneath. He asked Mr. Dufour to leave some copies there for anyone who wanted to take one. Mr. Dufour made a face, looking toward the street as if someone might be listening. His refusal showed up in a murmur and in bodily tension, a request that the grocery not become a place of trouble, at a time when a neighborhood business depended on varied clientele and on not drawing unwanted attention. The Reverend did not raise his voice. He simply left the sheets near the register, like someone leaving a neighbor's message, and went out. Lucía picked up one of the sheets and read. The language was different from the emergency aid rules. There were words like right, protected, federal examiners. In Portuguese, diarito was a firm word. In French, droit also carried weight. In Spanish, derecho sounded like something that could be demanded. But Lucía knew that, in the wrong mouth, right became provocation, and the city still carried the habit of punishing provocation, with punishments ranging from embarrassment to loss of work and being stopped on the street. Even so, it was impossible not to feel a quiet heat on seeing it printed, as if someone, somewhere, had written that it was not a favor, and as if the mimeograph printing, cheap and repeatable, were a form of insistence. On Friday, September 17th, a man named Jean-Paul Landry came into the grocery around 5 in the afternoon, when the sun was already lowering and the street grew noisier, with shifts ending and commerce try to normalize hours. He worked as a carpenter, helping repair houses in the 9th Ward. His hands were cracked and his face marked with dust, dry with dust mixed with old mud. He spoke French with his mother and English at work. He took a sheet of the registration pamphlet and began reading slowly, moving his lips without sound, as if measuring the distance between the words and his own life. Lucía, behind the counter, saw his hesitation and came closer. The offer of help came in simple English, and then the explanation shifted to French when his face relaxed, because the right language reduced effort and shame. Jean-Paul pointed to the sentence about the absence of a literacy test and federal supervision. His doubt appeared as a short question in French, heavy with the recent past, about the questions they used to block people. Questions that did not measure reading, but submission. Lucía reread. The text promised suspension of the test in certain areas and mention oversight, but reality could be more crooked, with delays, side requirements, and the old technique of telling people to come back. She could turn it into an announcement of a miracle and give immediate courage. She could also make everything so fragile it became resignation. She chose a translation that did not sell a miracle. The prohibition on using the test to prevent registration, the existence of oversight, and the possibility they might try to delay anyway. Only now with more risk of leaving a trace, because paper and procedure, when noted down, could become evidence. Jean-Paul asked what would be needed. Lucía listed identification, address, and time. The word time came out as something expensive because it meant missing work, paying for transportation, waiting in line, and going back more than once. He nodded and folded the sheet carefully, putting it in his pocket next to a short pencil. He bought flour and a can of evaporated milk and left, carrying a piece of paper that seemed small but pulled routine in another direction, as if a trip to the courthouse could enter the calendar of a week of repairs and survival. The following week, the effect of those translations began to show up as small changes in the way people entered the grocery. Some arrived straighter, paper in hand, asking for explanations not only of rules, but of terms. Authorized, proof, the difference between may and must. Lucía answered, and, with each answer, felt she was moving something that was not only language. She was moving the idea that someone could demand something without asking a favor, but also the idea that a printed promise could become disappointment if read the wrong way, especially when the counter on the other side had the power to deny without explaining. The moral catalyst came on a Saturday, September 25th, when Mrs. LeBlanc returned, this time with a harder face. She had gone to the emergency assistance office in an improvised building near the municipal auditorium on Loyola Avenue and had come out empty-handed after facing line, heat, and the kind of waiting that costs an entire morning. They said the staying electric bill did not count, that she needed a more recent document, that she should come back another day. She understood the return as a shove. She entered the grocery with the children behind her and dropped a small bag of beans on the counter. The explanation she brought, mixing English and French, was direct. At the window, no one treated the text as a guarantee, and the phrase "maybe eligible" had been handed back as maybe, with the weight of hours in line and shame, and with the feeling that maybe was a way of denying without saying no. Lucía felt her face heat up. She remembered how she had translated, trying to be honest and still keep the person moving. But the woman had heard chance, and chance had become a bus fare, waiting, other people's looks, and going home with nothing. Mr. Dufour, listening, raised his hands in a short gesture, as if he wanted to wash the counter of anything that was not merchandise, and insisted that food was sold there. Mrs. LeBlanc did not shout. She just stood there, eyes shining with exhaustion, and her need filled the grocery more than any rule. The children needed to eat, and urgency did not fit into a form. Lucía looked at the children and saw the boy staring at the mint candies as if they were a plate. The uncomfortable clarity came whole. Translation was also responsibility for expectation. And there was the other side, which she could not ignore. If she always translated with hardness, without any possibility, she would be helping the rule crush faster. That could not be solved with a pretty sentence. It could be solved with preparation and with people going together, with a witness and notes, because what was said at a window could disappear if no one recorded it. That night, Lucía went home along a street where lamps were still failing, stretches where the lighting was weak and irregular. She lived in a rented room near Elysian Fields Avenue, in a house divided into 3, rent paid in cash, and simple house rules. The landlady, an older woman who spoke French and prayed in English, left a plate of rice on the stove when there was extra, plain cooked rice, sustaining food. Lucía sat on the bed and opened a notebook where she wrote down difficult words and equivalents, as if she could build a firm bridge between languages. She wrote may enlisted can, maybe is allowed, and beside it noted that it was not a guarantee. She wrote shall and noted must and will, with the observation that, when it came with police, it became a threat. She wrote right and noted diarrhea, with the reminder that saying it out loud required company, and that paper alone did not hold the body. The next day, Sunday, September 26th, She went early to St. Augustine Church in Treme. Not because she was devout, but because there you found people who knew about lines, offices, and how to ask for things without getting lost, in a space where information circulated along with notices and practical help. Outside, she heard two women talking about a group that helped with registrations and forms, people who went along to translate and to witness. It was not a big organization with a bright sign. It was a handful of volunteers, some students, some church women, a lawyer who only appeared when he could, and who understood the value of a name written down and a copy kept. Lucía approached without presenting herself as anyone important. She simply said she worked at a grocery and could read papers. One of the women, known as Mrs. Robinson, looked at her closely and left hanging a sentence in English about language as power and as risk, a warning that it drew attention. Lucía did not answer with certainty. She answered with necessity, and with a kind of courage that made no noise, because their courage was more useful when it did not become an announcement. On Wednesday, September 29th, Lucía began doing something that would change the rhythm of the grocery and the fate of at least one family. She started keeping copies of the pamphlets and writing short translations on the back in French and Spanish, with underlined words, using an ordinary pen and a steady hand so it would not become another smear. It was not an official service. It was counter-help. The notes made clear what was an attempt and what was a requirement, what was a right on paper and what was prudence on the street. May apply as may try, not a promise. Must is what they will demand. Right is better to go with someone and keep a copy. She placed the sheets under the glass of the counter, where ads for rooms to rent and jobs were kept, and where the paper stayed visible but protected from dirty hands and spilled coffee. Mr. Dufour noticed, and his discomfort showed in posture and in short words, without raising his voice, insisting that it was not meant to be there. Lucía kept her hands on the counter, as if holding something so it would not fall, and said the papers were arriving anyway, and it was better they leave understood. Dufour answered with the idea that understanding too much made people talk too much. Lucía did not turn it into an argument and continued, careful not to make the grocery stage. Even so, the change was visible. Instead of leaving with an explanation that got lost on the way, people left with written words they could show someone they could discuss at home. And discussing at home was the beginning of many things, including deciding whether it was worth facing line and window again. In early October, the city began to dry, but the marks remained. On October 6th, a fine rain fell over New Orleans and left the asphalt smelling of wet dust, lifting the odor of old mud where water had stood. At the grocery, Jean-Paul returned with the registration sheet folded and crumpled in his pocket. He had decided to go to the office on Tulane Avenue the following Friday. He wanted to carry with him a short sentence in English, neatly written, to use in case they tried to confuse him, because he knew confusion often came in the form of technical words and hurry. Lucía wrote on a piece of paper and below, in French, wrote the meaning. She avoided grand advice. She preferred practical instructions, as if language were a coat. Jean-Paul kept the paper as if he were keeping medicine, something small that could make a difference at the right moment. On Friday, October 8th, Lucía did not go with him. She had her shift, and Mr. Dufour would not let her off, because the grocery depended on hands at the counter and an open register. She learned the result that same afternoon, when Jean-Paul appeared again, face closed and a small bruise on his lip. More shame than injury. He did not spill everything at once. He bought a packet of salt and kept looking at the counter, as if the counter were safer than the street. The sequence, he told, in low French, came in familiar stages. First the claim that a document was missing, then the claim that the name was different, then the order to come back. There was also a man outside saying it was not worth it, and people writing down license plates. The bruise on his lip had come from a shove on a tight stairway. Nothing that became a hospital visit, but enough to remind him that closed doors often struck someone's body, even when the paper spoke of protection. The hardest consequence, the irreversible one, came not with blood in the street, but with stamped paper and the loss of a job, the kind of violence that did not make headlines. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday, October 19th, Tomas Rivera left the shop later because the boss had received an urgent request to repair a truck to carry construction materials, in a period when rebuilding created urgencies and extended shifts. He crossed St. Claude Avenue with a bag of bread and a can of sardines, trying to get home before any trouble. In his pocket, he carried a crumpled paper Lucía had helped him prepare weeks earlier. The work address and the supervisor's name, in case someone asked, a common precaution when a worker's word was not enough. Near a block with poles still patched, a patrol car stopped. 2 officers got out. The questions came fast, the kind that did not expect a correct answer. Tomas tried to show the paper and explain the delay. His language stumbled. The English came out missing pieces. One of the officers took the paper and read it aloud, laughing at a misspelled word. They told Tomas to lean against the car, search the bag, made him wait standing with his face turned toward the headlight. There was no fall and no siren to a hospital. There was humiliation and stolen time. In the end, they let him go with a dry threat that next time it would not be like this. And the paper went back into his pocket folded in a way that seemed dirtier, as if the very attempt to protect himself had become a reason for mockery. The next day, October 20th, Tomas showed up at the grocery earlier than usual, with the closed face of someone who had not slept right. He did not ask for any rule translated. He simply placed on the counter a note from work in English with a few lines. The note said that, for insubordination and absence from duty, Tomas was dismissed. It was a short text, without explanation, as if a life could fit on half a sheet. The delay the night before, caused by the stop and the waiting, had become justification. The shop did not want trouble, did not want discussion, did not want an employee now seen as a complication, in a market where the need for labor lived alongside fear of drawing attention. Tomas stood still, as if the grocery had suddenly gotten hotter. His question, in low Spanish, came as a need for confirmation, and Lucía read it twice, not from difficulty, but because a sentence like that always seemed impossible. She translated without ornament, careful not to hurt more than the paper already hurt, dismissed for lateness and insubordination, with no explanation beyond that. Tomas gripped the edge of the counter, and the next question came like emptiness. What to do now? Lucía did not offer ready comfort. She offered what she had: keep the note, make a copy, gather proof, speak with the church group that helped with paper and complaints, because going alone rarely helped, and because the difference between a story and a record was what could sustain a complaint. The news traveled the way news travels in a neighborhood. Over a sack of rice, under a door, in the middle of a sentence in mixed language, and each repetition added a little fear and a little anger. Tomas's wife, Marisol, appeared 2 days later, October 22nd, with a scarf tied on her head and the look of someone who had added up too many numbers. She asked for credit. Mr. Dufour hesitated, looking at the ledger where names and amounts had been accumulating since the storm. His refusal came without cruelty, but with fear, and the line about there already being too much credit sounded more for himself than for her, as if he were calculating the limits of his own business. Marisol held her bag against her chest. Her Spanish came out mixed with French learned from neighbors, and what she described about offices and papers was the same dance as always. Promise of help, demand for a document, then demand for another document. A clinic station announced as free and then medicine charged. Her confusion was the confusion of paper becoming world, with rules that changed depending on the window and the day. Lucía came out from behind the counter and went to Marisol. She took the credit ledger from Mr. Dufour's hand with a careful gesture, as if asking permission without asking, and insisted the entry be made. Mr. Dufour looked at her, looked at Marisol, and wrote it down, grumbling. Marisol left with rice, beans, a piece of cheap bacon, and a packet of coffee, items that carried a week when money failed. At the door, she stopped and turned only her face back, leaving in the air a reference to the paper Tomas had carried, the proof that had not become protection. Lucía understood without needing a complete sentence. And in that moment something changed in her in a way that could not be undone. Translating could not be only making words understandable. It also had to prepare people for the space between what the paper said and what a boss's desk, an office window, or a street patrol did. In the days that followed, Lucía joined the volunteer group Mrs. Robinson had mentioned. She did not become a leader or a public face. She became a useful presence. On October 28th, she went with Marisol to an assistant's office downtown near Loyola Avenue, stood in line, listened to tired employees, helped fill out aid and coupon forms, and wrote down the name of whoever served them, as if collecting pieces so the story would not become rumor, because name and date were what remained when the word at the window changed. She translated may qualify as possibility with obstacles and must provide as a requirement, without which the process did not move. Marisol did not like the hardness, but she preferred hardness to surprise, because surprise cost bus fare and food. Lucía also began doing something smaller, but constant. At the grocery counter, she stopped using words that turned into easy hope. When someone asked whether they had a right, she answered with sentences that put the right in the proper place. The paper said it was possible to apply. The office decided it was better to go accompanied, keep a copy, write down the time and the name. She saw initial disappointment on some faces, but she also saw preparation, like someone closing a coat before stepping into a known wind, like someone learning not to give their whole body to a printed word. In early November, with milder weather and slightly longer nights, the grocery went back to selling more ordinary things. Apples, fresh bread, laundry soap, with more regular deliveries and fewer stock shortages. But the credit ledger grew thicker. Mr. Dufour began to sign more. Sometimes he blamed Lucía without saying it directly, as if her translations had brought poverty into the cash register. Other times he simply seemed tired, a man trying to control what could be controlled, in a business where the margin was narrow and crisis widened everything. On November 15th, Jean-Paul came in with a small smile, almost hidden. He placed on the counter a receipt. He had managed to register after going 3 times, after bringing a new bill, after waiting hours and not answering provocations, following the discipline of not giving the window the pretext it was looking for. He did not celebrate loudly. He simply showed the paper as one shows that a fragile object crossed a hard path without breaking. Lucía looked and nodded, and the advice she offered was practical, in French: keep it in a dry place. Jean-Paul put it away, bought bread, and left. Outside, the street went on the same, with children running and a dog sleeping in the shade. But inside some houses there were new papers in drawers, and inside some conversations there was less whisper than before, because a registration completed changed the tone of a sentence. In December, Tomas did not return to the shop. He began taking small repair jobs, neighborhood work, because trained hands do not disappear, they only change place, and because rebuilding left small jobs everywhere. Help was slow, interviews were scheduled and rescheduled, forms asked for terms that had no easy correspondence in Spanish, and bureaucracy demanded a patient's hunger did not have. Lucía went to their house once, in the 9th Ward, still smelling of damp wood, carrying a bag of groceries and a stack of papers. Tomas sat near the window, looking at the street without really looking. He spoke little. When he spoke, it was to record that the boss had sent word through someone else, as if he did not want to put his own name on the dismissal. The loss was concrete. Wages gone, insurance not coming, respect made smaller, and the feeling that the city charged the full price from those with the least margin. Lucía did not offer ready comfort. She organized the papers on the table, made copies, wrote names and days in the corner, as if order could at least reduce the feeling of being at the mercy of things. Marisol made coffee and kept the house moving with survival energy. The small children, who still did not understand the full weight, played with a pot lid on the floor. The afternoon ended with humidity sticking to the skin and the street outside with old watermarks on the lower walls, reminding them that the city was still learning to dry, and that drying was not only removing water, it was rebuilding routine and paper. At the beginning of 1966, Dufour Grocery remained in the same place, and Lucía remained behind the counter. The ceiling fan kept pushing the air, now colder, and the languages kept mixing as always. Lucía began listening more closely to what each person meant when they said right. For some, it was food on the table. For others, it was walking down the street without being stopped for any reason. For others, it was a paper with their names spelled correctly in a government file. She knew, with the precision that only came from seeing consequences, that a translation could inflate a right until it became promise and a fall, or reduce a right until it became resignation and hunger, and that the best she could do was keep the person standing, eyes open, without selling certainty where there was only procedure. On Thursday, February 10th, on a gray afternoon with the smell of rain on the Mississippi, Mrs. LeBlanc came into the grocery again. She had finally obtained a small emergency assistance and a food coupon. It was not much, but it was enough to change the week, the kind of relief that shows up in small purchases and in less silence at the table. She placed on the counter a bag of flour and a bar of soap, and for the first time since September, her children did not look at the mint candies as if they were a meal. The information she left, in low French, was that this time they accepted it because there was a letter from the pastor and a neighbor went with her. Lucía nodded and let her face relax into a brief smile, the kind that does not tempt luck, because she knew the difference had been less the word and more the presence and the right paper on the right day. The following week, Marisol returned to the grocery with a small, practical piece of news. Tomas had begun repairing fans and radios for neighbors, and someone from a church group had pointed out a warehouse that needed careful hands to sort parts. Seated work, paid by the day. It was not what he had before, but money was coming in again, and that had its own sound when counted on a kitchen table. Mr. Dufour watched Marisol pull out a few crumpled bills and pay part of the tab. He made a mark in the ledger and, without looking much at Lucía, pushed across a bag of rice a little larger than the order, a dry gesture that served as help without becoming conversation, as if help had to be disguised as commerce. At the end of that day, when the spring-loaded door stopped swinging and the shutters were closed, Lucía stayed one more minute arranging the sheets of paper under the counter glass. There were old translations stained with coffee. There were underlined words. There were days written in the corners. She threw away some illegible copies and kept others in a shoebox, not out of nostalgia, but because in that neighborhood proof was a form of defense, and because what was kept could be shown when someone said they had never said it. Outside, New Orleans went on with its sounds of a distant streetcar, a radio in a window, footsteps on uneven sidewalk. Inside the grocery, the shelves were a little fuller than in September, and the credit ledger still existed, but now it had new marks of payment and a space that was beginning to ease. Lucía turned off the counter light, adjusted her apron, locked the door, and put the key in her pocket, and the gesture closed another shift with the city still marked by water and by paper, but with people slowly learning to bring the right document, the right company, and the right word to the right place, until routine could fit again, once more inside an ordinary week. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.